enfants qui doivent leur faire. Ils ont refait plein de salles qui, franchement, le méritaient bien moins que celle-ci. Mais bon. Alors, attendez, j'ai besoin de ça. Donc, j'installe. Il faut que ça marche en plus, parce que c'est le début de l'année, quand même. Alors, ça aussi, j'aime. Le truc est là. Et la prise, là-bas. Donc, comment on se met pour... cette prise. Alors, je vais déjà... Il y a quelqu'un qui me fait un stylo. Je ne m'en montre pas, je prends. Je vais faire l'appel, hein, parce que pour les débuts, on veut être sûr que les groupes sont bien faits. Alors, Marine Bartolini. Est-ce qu'elle est là, Marine? Non. Ilona. Oui. Fanny Belair. Oui. Félicia. Oui. Pauline Charrier. Élise Chérie. Oui, pardon. Vous n'avez pas vu. Ashraf Chouichi. Merci pour le squash. Lucas Colombin, je l'ai vu. Florie Crunchamp. Marie Dafonte. Marie, elle n'est pas là. Jessica Darbois, oui. Alexandra Delamotte, ok. Viviane, oui. Arthur Donner, ouais. Victor Gabriel, ok. Apolline, oui. Mylène Giffard, oui. Camille Hilaire. Camille, oui, pardon. Marina Echadalen, ok. Léa Impellicelli, je vois. Marion Jacques. Marion, oui. Vincent, je l'ai vu. Inès, oui. Lucie Klein. Chloé. Koch. Anaïs Lapré. Ouais. Oriane Leroy. Oui. Margot L'Huillier. Ouais. Manon Luc, oui. Cédric Lupi. Oui. Pardon, je n'avais pas vu. Alice Maillot. Et Coralie Marc. Coralie, non. Estelle, je l'ai vu. Louise Masson, oui. Théo Michel, oui. Capucine Audin, oui. Morgane Penquin, oui. Paul Fichon, oui. Fakri,
ouais.
Héloïse Rémy, oui. Pauline Richter, oui. Thibaut Roth, oui. Maxime Rudinski, okay. Quentin Schulz, oui. Nadège Seyer, oui. Payam, oui. Amanda, non. Et Margot Viol, ouais. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a des personnes que je n'ai pas appelées? Erasmus, quel est votre nom alors? D'accord, BREMATH, je crois. D'accord, donc je vous ouvrirai accès en ligne. Oui, donc ça s'écrit comment votre nom? DE sans S? Et votre prénom? Élise. Très bien. Et est-ce qu'il y a d'autres personnes que je n'ai pas appelées? Non? Donc je récapitule. Marine Bartolini n'est pas là. Marie Dafonte. Coralie Marc. Et Amanda. Ok. C'est pas pour noter les absences, hein, c'est juste pour voir si... D'accord, donc bon, de ce point de vue, ça a l'air d'être à peu près exact. Alors, j'explique en français, en gros, en quoi va correspondre le cours, et ensuite l'ensemble du cours sera bien sûr en anglais. Donc, c'est un cours de civilisation, comme son nom l'indique. Contrairement au cours de civilisation que vous avez eu, pour ceux d'entre vous, en tout cas, qui ont fait leur L1 et leur L2 ici, il ne s'agit plus d'un cours général qui fasse une sorte de panorama, soit de la civilisation britannique, soit de la civilisation américaine, soit du Commonwealth. Il s'agit bien, en L3, de vous permettre de choisir un sujet précis sur un aspect de la culture, civilisation des pays de langue anglaise. Donc, vous aviez le choix entre un cours sur le retour de l'esclavagisme, donc civilisation américaine, ou ce cours qui porte sur la civilisation on va dire, du tournant du XXe siècle, fin du XIXe siècle, début du XXe siècle. Donc, la première séance, elle va être un petit peu, j'allais dire, je ne dis pas rébarbative, mais il faut que je vous donne des informations sur la période victorienne. Avant de pouvoir, j'allais dire, avoir le moyen d'analyser les documents que j'ai mis en ligne et de travailler dessus, il faut que vous ayez un certain nombre d'éléments sur la période victorienne, et notamment sur la fin de la période victorienne et la période édouardienne. Donc on va passer une séance qui va être un peu une séance de CM où vous allez écrire. Donc ce qui n'est pas nécessairement le plus intéressant, mais c'est nécessaire de passer par là avant de pouvoir, à partir de la semaine prochaine, travailler à partir de documents et avoir, j'allais dire, les bases pour pouvoir comprendre dans quel contexte ces documents ont été écrits. Alors, les documents qui ont été mis en ligne, je vous les présente. Donc, ils sont sur la page Arche DL3. Donc, dans rubrique UE 502, civilisation. Donc, Solange, je vous donnerai un accès. Et puis, pour Élise, dès que vous serez inscrite, vous y aurez accès. Sinon, vous pouvez demander à quelqu'un de vous les envoyer en attendant. Enfin, voilà. Donc, si vous allez sur la page Arche en ligne, c'est que ça marche. Donc, sur la page DL3, je vais mettre en route la vidéoprojection. Il fait une chaleur, je ne sais pas. Vous voyez quelque chose apparaître? Non. Mais lui aussi, il est allumé là, mais si ça. Ah, il faut que ça. Ouais, je vais laisser faire, on ne va pas faire grand chose de plus. Alors, donc dans la rubrique UE 502, vous avez donc les documents de cours pour mon cours. Et puis, vous avez, alors je vous explique, il y a 4 documents comme ça qui ressortent, qui sont classés par semaine. Donc, ce sont principalement des sources primaires, pas toutes, mais quasiment toutes des sources primaires, c'est-à-dire des sources d'époque. Des textes à partir desquels on va travailler pour essayer de comprendre comment les personnes, à l'époque, exprimaient leur point de vue sur le sujet qui nous intéresse et que je vous présenterai tout à l'heure. Donc, c'est classé par semaine. Donc, vous avez les documents des semaines 1 et 2 ici, sur lesquels on travaillera surtout la semaine prochaine, mais on commencera un petit peu cette semaine, mais ça sera surtout la semaine prochaine, quand on parlera de la sphère publique et de l'entrée dans la sphère publique. Et puis ensuite, vous avez toute une série d'articles de revues qui sont classés aussi par semaine. C'est-à-dire que pour chaque semaine, vous avez 2, 3, 4 articles. Ce sont des articles qui sont à lire également. Donc à vous de faire les lectures avant les cours, normalement. À vous de faire les lectures avant les cours. De toute façon, ce sont des textes. Alors, je précise quand même que les 3 premiers textes, Theory of the Public Sphere, Liberalism, the Press and the Construction of the Victorian Public Sphere et Constructing a Public Sphere, ce sont des articles qui sont plus des approches sociologiques de la notion de Public Sphere et sur lesquelles l'examen ne portera pas. Je les ai mis là pour pouvoir en lire des extraits, mais ces 3-là, vous pouvez considérer qu'ils sont hors programme. En revanche, il faut absolument lire tous les autres, y compris celui-ci de Judith Wolkowitz, qui explique très bien certains enjeux qu'on traitera la semaine prochaine. Donc pour la semaine prochaine, il faut avoir lu ce texte, les autres si vous voulez, mais c'est moins fondamental. Et puis, il faut avoir jeté un coup d'œil à tous les textes que j'ai indiqués ici dans Weeks 1 and 2, et qui sont des textes donc primaires, alors avec des cartoons, avec des extraits de poèmes, avec des extraits de livres, sur lesquels on travaillera la semaine prochaine. Donc lisez-les, c'est pas très long, hein, il y a une dizaine de pages, C'est pas très long, mais lisez-les parce que pour pouvoir en discuter la semaine prochaine, il faut que vous ayez fait ces lectures avant. On reprendra bien sûr des extraits, mais il faut avoir fait ces lectures avant. Voilà. Concernant les modalités d'examen pour ce cours, alors je mettrai en ligne les modalités d'examen de la licence dans la semaine, je pense, d'ici la semaine prochaine au moins. Elles seront sur la page Arche. Il s'agit pour ce cours d'un oral. Hein. Donc d'un oral en fin de semestre, pendant la session d'examen, en général en janvier. On fait rarement ça au mois de décembre, puisque vous savez que la session d'examen commence à la fin du mois de décembre, enfin à la fin juste avant les vacances de Noël, et qu'ensuite elle reprend début janvier. Donc en général on fait ça plutôt début janvier. Donc c'est un examen pour lequel vous avez 1 heure de préparation pour l'oral, 1 heure de préparation et 20 minutes de passage à l'oral. Et les 20 minutes de passage à l'oral, on va vous donner en fait, en général, soit un extrait, soit 2 extraits, pas plus d'un recto verso. Très souvent, il va y avoir un extrait de texte et une image, par exemple. Et on va vous demander, à partir de ces 2 extraits qui peuvent être soit des sources primaires, soit donc des sources primaires que vous avez à lire dans le cadre du cours, soit des sources secondaires, les articles de revue, sauf les 3 que j'ai cités, que vous avez à lire pour les cours. Donc ça sera uniquement des extraits pris de ces textes-là, d'où l'importance d'avoir lu au moins une fois ces textes et de les avoir compris surtout, pour ne pas être pris au dépourvu le jour de l'examen. Et à partir donc de ce ou ces extraits, on va vous demander de bâtir une problématique permettant de faire ressortir les grands enjeux qu'on aura étudiés dans le cours. Donc le but n'est pas de réciter le cours lors de l'oral, c'est pas du tout ça, mais c'est de prendre les textes, de partir des textes, de partir des observations que vous faites sur les textes ou le texte qu'on vous a donné, et à partir de ces observations, d'essayer de replacer dans le contexte qu'on a étudié en cours. Le cours, il est là pour vous présenter le contexte, et puis à l'oral, il faut que vous montriez que maintenant, à partir de ce contexte que vous avez analysé lors des cours, à partir de documents aussi que vous avez analysés lors des cours, vous êtes capable, à partir de n'importe quel document autour de cette thématique, de pouvoir faire une présentation qui mette en perspective, j'allais dire, la période, les enjeux de la période autour de la thématique qu'on a développée. D'accord ? On fera des exercices, hein, c'est-à-dire j'essaierai au moins 2 fois dans le semestre, voire 3 fois par semestre, de vous laisser, je ne sais pas moi, une demi-heure ou 3 quarts d'heure pour réfléchir à par exemple un sujet d'examen, un sujet d'oral, et puis ensuite on voit ensemble comment on organise les idées, comment faire un plan à partir de là. Donc il y aura des pauses comme ça dans le cours qui nous permettront de nous entraîner à ça. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions là-dessus ou pas? Non? So, you've seen that the title of this course is Going Public. Going public is an expression which I took from Judith Wolkowitz in one of her books that she entitled Going Public. It's the idea of entering the public sphere, becoming visible in the eyes of the others. This is what going public means in this particular instance concerning this course. So what we're going to deal with throughout the semester is the type of groups in Britain, the types of social groups, but not only social groups, ethnic groups, gender groups, who at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century started to become more and more visible in the public sphere. And of course, to analyze this, we'll first need to define what the public sphere is. This will be the point of our next lesson. We'll focus on a few definitions of the public sphere. What is a public sphere? Is a public sphere only a physical space or also a more virtual space? This is what we'll try to define, starting from definitions written by sociologists, especially, So this will be the point of next week. And we'll try to see from these definitions of the public sphere how some groups in late Victorian Britain and Edwardian Britain started to be more and more visible in the public sphere. I would like to start this analysis, not today, because today we're going to analyze the background of the late Victorian and early Edwardian or Edwardian societies. But later on in the course, from week 3, I would like to take different types of groups who became more and more visible at the end of the 19th century. The first type of group is a social group. It's what I called the poor, because this is how they were called at the time. The poor who became more and more visible, which doesn't mean that there were no poor before the late Victorian time, but simply that the poor became visible in the public sphere. We'll explain why. We'll explain the context which made poverty more and more visible in the public sphere. And this is why today, in the first class, I'll focus on all the changes that completely reshuffled frontiers in the late Victorian society, and that completely changed the society of the time. So the first group is the group of the poor, as they were called at the time. The second group is the group of the aliens, as they were called at the time. The word alien was the word used to speak about ethnic minorities, you would say today. And the word itself is particularly significant, particularly full of meaning, because an alien is someone who is apart from your own society. So when you use the word ethnic minority, this has still another dimension. But at the time, it was the word alien which was used. And we'll explain what an alien was at the time, what the definition of an alien was, where the word alien comes from. Well, today, when you speak of an alien, he is an extraterrestrial person. So, but you see what it meant to speak of foreigners, immigrants, as aliens at the time. And we're trying to define how they also became more and more visible in the public sphere at the end of the Victorian period. And the reasons for this new visibility, and there are multiple reasons to explain this. And the third group we'll focus on is a group defined by its gender. This is women. Another minority group, minority not in the sense that there were a few women, of course, but minority in the sense that they were not visible in the public sphere, that is, in the sphere where all the decisions were taken, right? So this will be the third group we'll study. So we'll devote a few weeks to each of these groups, and we'll see that there are many similarities in the way aliens, poor, and women were treated at the time, in the way they were spoken of at the time, and in the way they, little by little, became more and more visible in the public sphere. Of course, this was not only a British phenomenon. This was mostly a Western European phenomenon at the time. But we'll focus on the phenomenon in Britain, of course, and we'll study different texts of the time, which will show the evolution of the perception of these different groups and how, little by little, the frontiers that existed between rich and poor, between men and women, between foreigners and native British, started to be more and more blurred. So this is the main leading thread, I would say, of the course. But before being able to analyze this and before being able to focus on specific late Victorian and Edwardian texts, allowing you to understand
the type of evolution in the perception of these groups, you need, of course, to know more about the late Victorian period, the Victorian period generally speaking, but especially the late Victorian period, the turn of the century, and the Edwardian period. So this is what we're going to do today. Well, first, you've had, well, most of you, I guess, a few classes on the Victorian period during your second year, but probably not in as much detail, or I would like to focus on some details that probably were not dealt with, because this was a general introduction to the Victorian period. Well, the first one is that when you speak of the Victorian period, you generally divide the periods into three sub-periods. What is called the early Victorian period, the mid-Victorian period, and the late Victorian period. This is important because the Victorian period is a very long one. Only Elizabeth II has, well, or I can't remember the exact number of years that she's been ruling, well, 60 something, but Queen Victoria ruled over England between 1837 and 1901. Right. So this is a very long reign, obviously, and only Queen Elizabeth has exceeded the number of years in power of a monarch in Britain. So Victoria, for more than a century, was the only monarch who had ruled over Britain for so long. And this means that this is 60, 64, no. Yeah, 64 years. 64 years, which means almost 3 generations of British people. So this is a very long time. And this is why it's very useful to divide the period into 3 sub-periods, as, of course, there were many changes over that long period of time. Of course, when we'll speak of the Edwardian period, which was quite short, we'll speak of the Edwardian period as a whole. So early, mid, and late. So what are the dates? They are not exact dates, of course, but what are the dates of these 3 stages of the Victorian period? The early Victorian period is generally considered to be the period between the access to the throne of Queen Victoria. She was young, she was 18, I think, at the time. So she was very young, she was inexperienced at the time. So 1837 until, well, the date which is generally quoted is 1851. 1851 being an important date in the history of Great Britain, a cultural event that took place at the time. It's not a political event, but it's a cultural event which, in a way, characterized the grandeur. Exhibition, the Great Exhibition. Yeah, absolutely. It's the date of the Great Exhibition in London. And why was the Great Exhibition so important and so significant? Well, I'm going to show you something. I think it's here. No, it's not here. Sorry. Well, the Great Exhibition was that's what I wanted to show you. Yeah, the Great Exhibition was organized in Crystal Palace. This is a place which no longer exists today. And for the first time, they had built a palace, a big structure, which was made in glass and iron, glass and metal. So this was, I would say, an architectural feat at the time. This big structure of glass and metal, and this big structure which was built for the exhibition, but it was a kind of kit structure, you know. And after the exhibition, it was rebuilt elsewhere in London until it was destroyed or half destroyed in a fire later, but much later. So this Crystal Palace, well, you still have pictures of Crystal Palace if you want to see what it looked like. Ah oui, mais là, ça sort le foot. C'est le nom d'une équipe, non? Crystal Palace, je crois. Bah alors, vous ne connaissez même pas le foot. Ça. Si, je suis sûr. Oh, what? Yeah. So this was what the Crystal Palace looked like. So you see, it was it was situated in Hyde Park, so in a big park. And this is what it looked like. It was a beautiful structure, all made in glass and iron, as I've said. So it was beautifully designed by someone called Joseph Paxton. And in a way, what the Queen, and especially her husband at the time, because he was in charge of the project, well, not directly, of course, but he gave the directions. And what the Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, wanted was to show through this structure the grandeur of the United Kingdom, the grandeur of Britain, the grandeur of England especially, to the whole world. And it was the first time probably in history when a great exhibition could attract people from so many countries because of all the development in terms of communication means and in terms of transport. So the palace itself was a beautiful structure which was admired throughout the world, and it was considered to symbolically represent the grandeur of Britain. And when you look at the map of the ground floor of the exhibition, well, it's difficult to, well, you can't see much here. But what is interesting is that, more or less, from a symbolical point of view, the English exhibits were much in the middle of each floor, while the exhibits from all the colonies or all the other countries in the world were around the English exhibits. And the idea was to symbolically show Britain, England especially, as the center of the world at the time, the center of the world towards which all the different colonies, but also all the other countries converged and which they admired at the same time. So symbolically, the organization of the exhibition itself was very much important in this sense, to show the grandeur of Great Britain and how it wanted to be considered the center of the world. At the time, an expression was coined to speak about Britain. It was called the workshop of the world. The workshop of the world because it was the leading economy at the time, much before the United States became the leading economy. Britain was the leading economy, the workshop of the world. So 1851 is a kind of climax. It's a kind of year which symbolized the power of England and the power of Britain, generally speaking, as an imperial power, of course. The empire was at its height. It was not criticized at the time, whereas at the end of the 19th century there were some dissents about the empire, and there were dissensions about this. But at the time, the empire was not contested. So 1851, and the late Victorian period started, well, generally the mid-Victorian period is considered to go until the end of the 1870s, sorry, and the late Victorian period is generally considered to be the last 20 years of the 19th century, so 1880 to the death of Queen Victoria. Very often 1901 is included in the late Victorian period because it marks the end of the reign of this queen. Three stages in the Victorian period and three very different moves. You see, the first period lasts for about, well, let's say 20 years, the second one for about 20 years as well, and the last one for about 20 years. So it's one generation each time, about one generation each time. I'm going to say a few words about the early and mid-Victorian periods. This is probably what you know best about the Victorian period. But then I'm going to focus in more detail on the late Victorian period because this is the period we're interested in here. And the late Victorian period is generally much less analyzed in history books in the sense that it's, well, in literary anthologies, for instance, it's not particularly a period of great authors. Many authors of the late 19th century were either great authors who were at the end of their lives and who rather corresponded to the mid-Victorian period and still wrote a few books during the late Victorian period, but they're not associated with this part of the Victorian age. From a historical point of view, a political point of view, and a social point of view, there were many dissensions in the country, and Britain especially started to lose in power. So this period is very often not ignored, but at least less developed in history books than the other two periods. But we'll do the other way round. I'll say just a few words about the early and mid-Victorian period so that you have the main background to understand the late Victorian period, and then we'll focus on the late Victorian period. So, what were the characteristics of early Victorianism or the early Victorian period? This was when Victoria came to the throne. She came to the throne in a period of conflicts, social conflicts. And the conflicts at the time were mostly between landlords and manufacturers. That is, so far, Britain had been a rural country in which one class ruled the country. Which social class ruled the country? The upper class, also called the landlords, the aristocracy. The aristocracy. So, until the until the access of Victoria to the throne, the aristocracy had been leading the country. They were not contested in their leadership. Most of them were landlords. Remember that Britain at the time was a rural country before the Industrial Revolution. They were landlords, and they ruled as masters. They ruled as masters in the country. They were rich. They had the wealth. They had the lands. The lands, of course, the lands yielded money, and their power was not contested at the time. And little by little, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution from the end of the 18th century, and especially in the first part of the 19th century, another class of people started to become more and more important in the economy of the country. Who were these people?
Middle class?
The middle class, yes. The middle class, especially the upper middle class. The upper middle class, the bourgeois, as they were called. And can you quote specific occupations of the upper middle class? Did they work in agriculture?
Merchants.
Merchants, yes. So the upper middle class were rather merchants. I'm not speaking of a shopkeeper, I'm speaking of a merchant, which is completely different. Merchants, what else? Bankers, yes, bankers. Bankers, merchants.
Owners of factories.
Yes, manufacturers, absolutely. Factory owners or manufacturers. And the social fight, I would say, which existed in the first part of the Victorian age, that is, in the early Victorian age, was mostly the fight, the struggle between the aristocrats who were slowly losing their power, slowly losing their monopoly on British economy, because agriculture was slowly declining at the time. And on the other hand, the bourgeois, the upper middle class, the manufacturers, bankers, merchants of the time, who little by little became richer and richer, and very rapidly became much wealthier than some aristocrats, right? So there was this struggle between the two, the old world and the new world, in a way, at the time at least, the old world and the new world. What was the main difference between aristocrats and the upper middle class? Which meant a completely different philosophy.
They worked, well,
Yeah,
those
you're
ones
right.
worked, and the other ones, they only owned fields.
Yeah, they inherited their wealth.
They-
The aristocrats inherited their wealth from their wealth. They inherited their wealth from their families. That is, they inherited their manors, they inherited their lands, they inherited, and they didn't work. What was the expression used to speak of aristocrats at the time? They were called the leisured classes. The leisured classes. Why the leisured classes? Because they did not work. They did not work. So they spent their time, of course, giving directions to the people who worked for them, but mostly they didn't work. And for a very long time, when you study the history of leisure time in Britain, for a very long time, leisure was supposed to be reserved for the aristocrats, certainly not for the workers. And it's only at the end of the 19th century, especially, that leisure time for everybody started to develop, and that more and more people could enjoy leisure activities. So the aristocracy had an inherited wealth, whereas the merchants, bankers, manufacturers became rich thanks to their work. Absolutely. So a completely new philosophy of life, a completely new philosophy of or a completely new way of approaching the economy and the way the country would be ruled. So the first struggles at the time in the early Victorian period was this. It was the struggle between the aristocrats, the ones who once were the leaders, the only leaders, the uncontested leaders of the country, and the bourgeois, which was the emerging class, and which this class was starting to get more and more power throughout the country as the Industrial Revolution developed. So this period was a period of tensions, it was a period of social conflicts. And this is very well expressed, for instance, in a book written, a novel written by Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli was, he was the Prime Minister. He was Victoria's prime minister for many years. He was a conservative, and he was also a writer, a novelist, and he especially wrote a book which is very often quoted, which is Sibyl or the Two Nations. Sibyl or the Two Nations. And this is the story of Sibyl, a young woman. The story of Sibyl, but also and especially a kind of a social commentary on the two nations, that is, the two nations which struggled together at the time, with, on the one hand, the aristocrats who underwent a kind of declining power, Sibyl or the Two Nations. Sibyl, S-Y-B-I-L. So on the one hand, the aristocrats who underwent a declining power, and on the other hand, the emerging class, the manufacturers, the upper middle class, and of course, under them, from a social point of view, from the point of view of the hierarchy, of the social hierarchy, the workers, of course, either peasants or workers in factories. So this novel very well epitomizes the tensions that existed at the time, and the tensions which made that, according to Disraeli, Britain was becoming two nations in one, with, on the one hand, the aristocrats who tried to cling to their former power, and on the other hand, the manufacturers who were starting to take the power from the hands of the aristocrats. I'm not going to say more about the early Victorian period. A few words about the mid-Victorian period. The mid-Victorian period, that is after 1851, is very often called an age of equipoise. An age of equipoise, that is an age of harmony, an age of balance. And obviously, the Great Exhibition, the 1851 Great Exhibition, played a role in the harmony that followed, in the sense that it, in a way, it united British people around this great event. And Queen Victoria had an idea which probably had never been given before. Her idea was to invite as many people as possible to the Great Exhibition, whereas before the typical public of such an exhibition would have been the aristocracy and the middle class, upper middle class. But Queen Victoria was a queen who wanted to educate her people. And so she decided to organize days specially reserved for the poor, or at least for the working classes. Days when you paid much less to enter the exhibition. Well, of course, at the time, the rich people didn't want to visit the exhibition at the same time as the poor. So these were days reserved for the rich and days reserved for the poor. But you see, it was already, even if it is shocking for us, by our standards, this is shocking, to organize days for the poor and days for the rich, of course. But at the time, it was a great leap forwards. For one of the first times, working class people were invited, encouraged to visit a great exhibition which was going to open up their horizons by showing them exhibits from throughout the world, probably from countries they had never heard of before. So this was at the same time a shocking way of doing things, obviously, but also a great leap forwards by the standards of the time. And the fact that you wanted to unite a people around the Great Exhibition and to show them that they also mattered in the unity of the kingdom was very important, and explains, at least in part, the great harmony which followed. Britain was in an age of equipoise, an age of balance, an age when tensions, social conflicts, were more or less appeased. Of course, not all was beautiful in a perfect world, but if you compare, generally speaking, the early Victorian period and the mid-Victorian period, the difference is obvious. It was a much more harmonious time. It was a time when Great Britain was self-confident, when Great Britain knew that she was the workshop of the world, when Great Britain knew that all the different investments that had been made from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution started to yield results. And this result was its place in the world, its place as the center of the world. The British at the time liked imagining themselves as a kind of brain, as a kind of nervous center of the world, you see, with the colonies as peripheral elements, admiring the mother country, Great Britain. And as, from an economic point of view, it was a leading power as well, of course this reinforced this impression. So this period, the mid-Victorian period, is generally the period which is referred to when you speak of Victorian culture, Victorian literature. This is the period of all the great novelists of the time, William Thackeray, Charles Dickens, even if Charles Dickens started writing before, but he became famous especially at the time, so Charles Dickens, Thackeray, and all the other great Victorian writers. This is not the point here, of course, but I wanted to quote this. And yet, of course, little by little, this apparent harmony, this apparent balance, this apparent age of equipoise also hid some movements, underlying movements at the time, which were going to emerge at the end of the Victorian period, in the 1880s and 1890s, in the period which is most often called the late Victorian period, and on which I'm going to focus, as this is the period we'll study throughout this class. So the late Victorian period generally is generally said to start in the 1880s. Some say rather 1885, some others include the beginning of the 1880s. It's not very important in itself. There is not a precise date, there is not a specific date on which suddenly someone said, well, this is the late Victorian period. Of course, this is a reconstruction by historians, modern historians. But obviously, if you take the last 20 years of the 19th century, they were obviously a period with a particular mood, with a particular atmosphere, and I'm going to try and explain this mood, the reasons for this mood, and what it meant in terms of Victoria's reign. So, when you say late Victorian age, very often one of the first associations in your mind is to associate the late Victorian period with authors like, well, one of the great names of the time is Oscar Wilde. There are not so many great artists in the late Victorian period. Well, Thomas Hardy wrote a few books, but is generally not considered to be part of the late Victorian period. Well, he wrote books in the late Victorian period, but this was only a part of his production. And the only great name which comes to mind, and which is only associated with the late Victorian period, is generally Oscar Wilde. Well, you've all heard about Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is very symbolical of this late Victorian age because he represented the mood of the time. What do you know about Wilde? What did he write, for instance? The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is his only novel. The only novel he wrote is The Picture of Dorian Gray. Yes. He also wrote, yes, that is plays, comedies, but also other types of plays, tragedies, etc. But one of the main plays which he wrote and which is still played today is The Importance of Being Earnest, which is a kind of, well, it is very funny, it is very light, it can be staged in very modern types of theatres today. And I would say that the message of the importance of being earnest, even if the scene takes place in the late 19th century, is very modern as well. It's about the notion of identity. It's about the notion of lying and saying, telling the truth. It's about the masks that we put on our faces to forget who we are and to try to play a role in front of the others. So Oscar Wilde was very modern in the themes that he dealt with in this play. And he's also known for some poems. He was not particularly a great poet, but he wrote poems, he wrote essays. So this is not he was not a prolific author, or at least his production, the production which is worth studying today is very limited. The Picture of Dorian Gray, a few plays like The Importance of Being Earnest, and yet he remains someone who is very often quoted because he was very witty and he knew how to phrase his ideas in such a way that people remembered what he said. And he also knew how to capture the mood of the time, which was, and he explains this very well, or he expresses this very well in The Picture of Dorian Gray. At one point, there's a conversation between Lord Henry and a few guests, among which Dorian Gray is, if I remember well. And at one point, one of the characters say, fin du globe, no, fin de siècle. This was the expression used, the French expression used in English to refer to the late 19th century, fin de siècle. And the word fin is important. Fin de siècle was an expression which was mostly used by the decadents in France. The decadents in France before the 1880s, but it was an expression that they liked because it meant the end of something. The end of something. And it had a pessimistic overtone, if you want. So, fin de siècle, says a character. And another one answers, fin du globe. Still in French. Well, of course, the use of French, especially in an aristocratic circle, as is the case in The Picture of Dorian Gray, was very typical. It was a way of showing that you knew a few words in French, and you know, it's always it's exactly as when people today use English words to speak. But here, the idea was to use words that French artists used at the time, and it was so fashionable to use the same words. So fin de siècle, and the other answers fin du globe. Pas fin du global, fin du globe. Fin du globe. Which, of course, implies something very pessimistic, a very pessimistic mood. As if the fin de siècle, the end of the century, the end of the 19th century, also meant the end of the world, right? And this refers to a very largely held belief that fin de siècle are always feared to be equivalent with the end of the world. And there's a very interesting analysis of this made by historian Asa Briggs, who, by the way, defined the different periods, early, mid, and late Victorian period. And Asa Briggs wrote a book which is really fascinating, on all the fin de siècle from, I think, the 14th century to the 20th century, the end of the 20th century. And it's a very fascinating book which analyzes all the superstitions, all the beliefs, all the stories that people imagined at the end of each century, from the 14th century to today, because the end of the century approached. And it shows very well that, of course, in the 14th century, the superstitions were completely different from the superstitions at the end of the 20th century, but still there is this fear. Still, you find people who like warning the others that the end of the world is near and that we will never survive a return of the century. For instance, he explains that at the end of the 19th century, one of the great beliefs was that the Earth would be destroyed by a comet. It was the beginning of, well, not the beginning of astrology, of course. Astrology and astronomy especially had existed for long years, but many scientists worked on this, and there was especially the fear that the Halley comet would destroy the world. And you could find many cartoons at the turn of the century announcing this catastrophe and announcing the end of the world as they knew it at the time. But if you take the end of the 20th century, of course things have changed. The superstitions were not the same, even if you still had some people who warned the others that the end of the world would be. Yeah, what was the great fear at the end of the 20th century?
The internet shut down.
Yeah, the internet shut down, absolutely. And for months and months, the newspapers spoke about this. The fact that maybe the internet would shut down and all computers would go blank. And there was such a media coverage of this fear that even the people who would not have believed in this before were starting to be a bit afraid and saying, well, maybe my computer is going to shut down and we'll lose all the data that we have. Well, on a personal computer, it's not that important, but on a worldwide basis, of course, this could have consequences. And of course, nothing happened. But this is another example of the type of superstitions which exist at the end of the century. So obviously, the period itself, the fact that it's an end of a century, explains the pessimistic mood which marked the late Victorian period. So why this pessimistic mood, and what in the British society of the time and the British history of the time explained this pessimistic mood after the age of harmony and balance that the Victorians had undergone? Well, the first important point to explain this pessimistic mood was, I would say, the fact that Great Britain had been industrialized very early, one of the first countries to be industrialized, which meant that at the end of the century, its equipments were starting to grow old, right? And old-fashioned, which meant that they had to be replaced, but which also meant that some countries which had been industrialized later, rather in the mid-19th century than in the beginning of the 19th century, were starting to exceed Great Britain in terms of economic performances. That is the first explanation for the pessimism which little by little started to shake Britain at the time, was the loss of their economic power. Well, it was still a great economic power, of course, but its equipment was getting old, and some other countries, Western European countries or the United States, were starting to be equipped with more modern equipment and to be more performing on an economic scale. So Britain was no longer, or England more specifically, was no longer the workshop of the world, right? So economically speaking, the pessimism, the pessimistic mood of the period can be explained by this, by the decline in the British economy, and especially the English economy. So this is the first point. The fact that economically speaking, Britain was losing in power implied as well that from a social point of view, tensions reappeared. That is, the tensions which existed during the social tensions, which existed during the early Victorian period, which had been more or less appeased during the mid-Victorian period, started to reappear in the late Victorian period, and to reappear under another form, a new form, which was the rise of unionism. That is, the first trade unions who tried to defend the poorest, the weakest, that is mostly factory workers, mostly the people who lived in destitute areas of the city. And the period from the 1880s to the 1900s was marked by many strikes, and many strikes which struck the imagination of people, which struck people as a whole. And these strikes, as we will see, were, for instance, were a way for the poor, for instance, to enter the public sphere. I was speaking of becoming more visible in the public sphere. Well, typically, what the unions, the trade unions did by organizing some strikes, helped, of course, poor people to become more visible in the public sphere, because they expressed their discontent in the eyes of everybody else, and they could voice their discontent as they had never done before. So this is an example that we'll study later in the course. So, a decrease in economic power and growing social tensions marked the end of the Victorian period. Another important point was all the scientific debates which had taken place from the mid-Victorian period, but which started to have a great impact at the end of the 19th century. I'm not going to develop these debates. There are many of them, of course, but one of them especially was the debate directly or indirectly provoked by Charles Darwin's text, and especially his text on the origins of species. The origins of species. For the first time, a scientist tried to make a link between different species, and especially between apes and men. So the hypothesis was that apes and men were the same species, and that man was an evolution of the ape, which turned out to be a little more complex than that. But this is mostly what people understood from Darwin's theories at the time. So at the time, this led to many debates which we'll deal with throughout the course, because they influenced they influenced the perception that people had of aliens. For instance, the idea, according to pseudo-scientists of the time, that the ape was the beginning of the development of man, the first stage, if you want, of the development of man, and then that there were kinds of intermediary species, and that the more evolved species was the white Anglo-Saxon man, of course. And in between they put the Irishman. The Irishman was white but not Anglo-Saxon. So the Irishman, the black man, of course. Well, generally black and Irish were put on the same level, more or less. And then the apes. And this is where all these ridiculous theories, or all these ridiculous ideas, or all these ridiculous insults that some people still, unfortunately, use today, associating, for instance, black people with apes. This is where it comes from. Simply from scientists who were not good scientists, obviously, and who defined that if the white Anglo-Saxon was leading the world at the end of the 19th century, it was because he was the most evolved species, and that the Irishman, the black man, and all the others, well, under the label black man, at the time they included everyone, that is, everyone that was not white. An Indian was a black man at the time, for instance. So under the term black man, you had everybody else, and they were supposed to be a kind of intermediary stage of evolution, you see? And this is how these pseudo-scientists, and we'll study this when we study the perception of foreigners, this is how they explained that, for instance, in Great Britain you had the telegraph, the telephone, and trains, for instance, the railway, whereas in Africa, for instance, you had nothing of this. And they completely forgot the different cultures, the fact that some of these societies were much more ancient than the British society, of course, and that they were leading societies in the past in terms of inventions. If you think of Chinese inventions, for instance, and many others, and that in terms of art, in terms of architecture, there were wonders throughout the continents, not only in Britain, obviously. But they forgot about this, and they considered that the Anglo-Saxon was the kind of climax of the evolution of the ape, and that the others had still a long way to go to catch up with the white Anglo-Saxon man. Not only the white man, but the white Anglo-Saxon man. Not everybody was included in this. So you see how scientific racism, as it is called, was born typically in the Victorian period. And unfortunately, it explains many of the reactions that we still read today from people who take for granted some theories which were coined by scientists who were only pseudo-scientists at the time. But this is not the point today. We'll develop all this in another lesson. What was I speaking of? Yeah, so Darwin's theories, the fact that there was a link, a direct link between apes and men, challenged people's beliefs. Why? What did they think before? That man was
it came from the angel?
from
the angel.
Yeah, it was created by God. Yeah, absolutely. That man was created by God. It's the story of Adam and Eve, you know. And religion was particularly important at the time of the 19th century. And almost everybody, well, maybe not the very poor, but the very poor did not ask themselves such questions they had many other problems to deal with. So, but among the middle class, among the aristocrats, of course, religious education was almost a must at the time, and they'd been taught all their life long that man had been created by God, etc., etc. And suddenly, a scientist wrote that we men came from apes, which challenged the established beliefs of the time, and which explained that, well, some people started to forget about religion, or at least not to be as faithful to their religion as before, and some of them started to question the teachings of the Bible and the teachings of religion in general. So this also explains the fact that it was an age of uncertainties, an age of doubts, and that is, doubts, uncertainties generally generate anxiety. And anxiety explains the typical pessimistic mood of the late 19th century, fin de siècle, fin du globe, as the characters say in the picture of Dorian Gray. To give you an example, for instance, for the first time, probably, at the end of the 19th century, the newspapers started to speak of suicide. Well, suicide was never mentioned before, because it was against religious principles most of the time. But at the end of the 19th century, well, little by little, you could read articles on suicide, and when people killed themselves, committed suicide, well, it was mentioned as a suicide, and there were debates around the notion of suicide, which was typically in the mood of the time and in this pessimistic atmosphere that most people felt at the end of the 19th century. So the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, is the end of a long reign. It's at the same time the end of the Victorian period, and it also marks the death of the Queen, Victoria, 1901. So it's technically the beginning of the 20th century, but it's very often included in the late Victorian period. For the first time as well, people thought of their century with a number. It seems quite surprising today, but people in the 18th century did not say we live in the 18th century. This idea did not exist before. It's only towards the end of the 19th century that centuries were numbered, and that people started to think of themselves as belonging to a century in particular. This is so usual to us today that it seems surprising, but this is the case. And what also added to the doubts, to the uncertainties of people at the time, is the fact that the end of the 19th century was also the period when prehistory studies started. That is, the very concept of prehistory did not exist before the mid-19th century. The very concept of prehistory was coined during the Victorian period, towards the mid-Victorian, late Victorian period, and it opened up new horizons because it showed that history was not finite, you see, that before people thought that history had a start in a way, but now this start could not be defined. It could be millions and millions and millions of years before the first existing documents that people had about Roman people, Greek people, etc. So it meant that history was much longer than what people had thought, than what the Bible had taught them, And this added to the uncertainties, this added to the doubts of the time and to the general pessimistic mood of the time. So, this is what I wanted to say about the main three periods, but now I'd like to focus on the specificities of the late Victorian period and what marked the late Victorian period in terms of social situation, but also in terms of the new inventions that marked the century, and especially the end of the century. I've already quoted the new division into social classes, where the very notion of classes, social classes, is also a notion of the 19th century, where the aristocracy, then the middle class, upper middle class, and lower middle class, and the working classes. And more sociological studies were led on these social classes, and especially on the working classes, which participated as well in the new visibility of the poor, as we'll study later on. The great difference between the three classes was that the upper classes were supposed not to work, even if at the end of the 19th century, more and more aristocrats were compelled to work if they wanted to get by, because they had lost their wealth. And more aristocrats started to marry their daughter into the upper middle class. That is, with a rich banker or a rich American. Very often they prefer the Americans. I don't know why. I think they didn't want their daughters to marry a British banker. They preferred an American banker. I don't know why, but it was very often the case. So, mixed marriage, in a way, between social classes started to develop, and the wealthiest among the middle class started to be invited at the aristocrats' homes. For instance, they invited, well, it's typical of Oscar Wilde's plays. You could see these aristocratic circles, but these aristocratic circles being little by little almost invaded by upper middle class people, whom the aristocrats look at with suspicion, because they consider that they do not have the etiquette that the aristocrats do have, but whom they need at the same time because they have the money. So, little by little, these lines, social lines, started to get blurred. The group of the middle class were people who worked most of the time as what you call white collars today. That is, they worked in not as workers, not as factory workers. They had a job as a clerk or a journalist, a teacher, a doctor, or then for the upper middle class, a banker, a merchant, a lawyer as well. And very often they were paid each month or annually. While the working class, on the contrary, generally people working, or people from the working class, were paid on a day-to-day basis. That is, very often their contract was for 1 day or 2 days, sometimes a week. But generally they had to find a job almost every day, for the poorest of them, of course. Which explains the complete destitution of some of them and the utter poverty of some of the working class. But here again, there were different categories in the working class. There were those who were called the respectable poor, by the bourgeois, of course. The respectable poor generally had a job, which was not well paid, but they had a job, they had an apartment, a flat, and they could get by, well, with difficulty, but they could. And there were the destitute, that is, the people below the poverty line, the people who sometimes slept in the streets, the people who went to the poor houses. Well, we'll see all this when we focus on poverty. Yes, so this is a first specificity, this new division into social classes, and a gap which was becoming wider and wider between the wealthiest and the poorest. London was one of the places in the world in which this gap was the widest between the very rich and the very poor. And this was especially obvious during the season. During the season is the 4 or 5 months of the year in spring to late, well, yeah, to summer, when the aristocrats came to town. Most of the time they lived in the countryside, they had their manors in the countryside, but they came to town for the parliamentary session for most of them because, well, either the husband or the brother was in the House of Lords, you know. So they came to town, and this is when they organized their balls, their receptions, etc. So it lasted for a few months. And it was the time in the city when the contrast between the very rich and the very poor was probably most visible, because the rich were there. So first specificity. The second specificity, which is linked in a way with the evolution of the social classes and their role in society, was the opposition between city and countryside. We said that in the early Victorian period, the British society was still a very rural society, including the English society. At the end of the Victorian period, agriculture was in decline, and had been in decline for almost a century. So England, I'm speaking only of England here, because well, some parts of Scotland, Wales, were still very rural. But England was becoming more and more urban, more and more industrialized, with more and more factories, and especially the growth of very big cities. Well, among the cities that were created by the Industrial Revolution, not created in the sense that they did not exist before, but created in the sense that they became big metropolises. You may quote London, of course, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, among others. So the growth of cities and the displacement of many people from the countryside to the city. And this is very important to understand, because it will explain, as we'll see, the new visibility of the very poor in the conurbations of the time. When people lived in the countryside, in a small village, for instance, there was a certain kind of community, the village community. And the village community enabled most people to be able to live in appropriate conditions, in adequate conditions, because the community was here to help the different members of the community. But when these people decided to leave the countryside because they wanted to find another job, or simply because they were attracted to the big city. They were attracted to the big city, which offered a lot of leisure activities, which offered theatres, cinemas, which offered music halls. All that, of course, the countryside did not offer. When they decided to leave the countryside and to go to the cities, these people, most of the time, found themselves on their own. They were generally put in some sorts of ghettos. That is, they found themselves living in the same neighborhoods, typically the East End of London, for instance. So they lived in a way almost apart from society, almost isolated from society, and they no longer had the community, the village community, to help them, you see? So this is why in a way, they became more visible because they were at the same time isolated from the rest of society, but they were criticized for being a burden on society. Whereas in the context of the village and of the village community, everybody helped each other, and this was completely different. Among the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who left the English countryside to go to the big cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, London, many lived in utter poverty in London, probably poorer than they were in the countryside. And many girls, especially, fell into prostitution because it was the only way they had to earn money. Generally, they were prostitutes only for a few years, and if they were lucky, they met one of their customers, and one of the customers married them, and they left prostitution. But it was only if they were happy, of course. So, second important point: the late Victorian period was no longer a rural society, but an urban society. And an urban society means a completely different type of community. And people had to reinvent new communities, not to be completely isolated from the rest of society. Well, we'll see what kind of new community, but later in the course. A third capital aspect is the development of communications, generally speaking. The development of communications, because these communication means, we're going to play a crucial role in the new visibility of some groups, as we'll see later. By communication means, I mean first the media. Of course, newspapers did exist before the end of the 19th century. But what was the new factor at the end of the 19th century?
The radio? No.
Oh, no.
No.
Not yet. What was the new factor which explained that the media played a completely different role at the end of the century?
L'impression et puis le développement du train, en fait.
Alors l'impression, qu'est-ce que vous entendez par l'impression? La presse de Gutenberg, ça date d'avant, hein, bien avant. Donc c'est pas vraiment l'impression, mais vous vous rapprochez. Alors les librairies ambulantes, ça a joué un rôle, oui. Yeah. First, it's true, more people were able to read. Well, that's an important point. If you take the situation at the beginning of the 19th century and the situation at the end of the 19th century, I don't have the exact numbers, but there was a great leap forward. Well, just to quote one act, the 74, well, the date is not so important, it's the 70s, the Forster Act, the Forster Education Act, which made school compulsory until the age of 14, which was not the case before. Which meant that all children were supposed, at least, this was not the case among the poorest, of course, but they were supposed to go to school until the age of 14. This was a great step forward in the sense that, at the time, many children worked in the factories, in the mines, sometimes, or in the streets, from the age of 5. You can find testimonies of children as young as 5 years old selling products in the streets and explaining that they get up each morning at 6 o'clock and that they spend the day from 6 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the evening selling fruit or whatever product or working in the mine, etc., etc. Well, child labour was a reality in Victorian Britain, and children were very often exploited. The poorest, of course, not the children of the wealthy, of obviously. The poorest were completely exploited. So the fact that school was made compulsory, even if, of course, not everybody respected the rule, explains why more and more people could read, more and more women, more and more children. And as more and more people could read, more and more read the newspapers. But to be able to read the newspapers, you need to be able to read, but you also need other factors.
Electricity.
Electricity, yeah, electricity first. Electricity. Well, this may seem so obvious to us today, but when the houses of British people were not equipped with electricity, which was the case until the end of the 19th century, it's only at the end of the 19th century that more and more houses were equipped with electricity. Well, the only way to read a book after your working day was to use a candle, which is not particularly easy to be able to read a whole book or a newspaper. So, of course, the development of electricity at the end of the 19th century improved the conditions in which people could read. They were able to read, and they could, have the necessary conditions to be able to read at home. What else?
L'espresso.
De quoi?
J'ai dit l'espresso.
Ah.
C'est pas grave.
Ah, what else? Perfect. So what else? What else, according to you, among the factors which participated in this development of communication means and means of information? Well, you said the train. Why?
Well, it connected smaller towns to bigger towns.
Mm-hmm. And very often the newspapers were produced in bigger cities.
Yeah.
So it meant that the newspapers could be sent throughout the country on the same day as they were printed, right? So it meant that for the first time, towards the end of the 19th century, for the first time people or from the mid-19th century, people were able to read the London newspaper even if they lived in Scotland, for instance, which was also a great leap forward. There's another factor which you have forgotten. Well, you said printing. It's not printing in itself, because printing had existed for centuries. But,
The telegram?
yeah, we'll speak of this later. Yeah.
Telegraph. Telegraph.
Yeah, we'll speak of this later. No, it's the price. Yeah, the price, because the printing techniques became more and more performing and cheaper, especially. That is, instead of publishing a book or a newspaper for a very high price, which made it impossible for the poor or even the lower middle class to buy newspapers started to be produced, to be printed out on an industrial basis. The cost was lower, and as the cost was lower, more and more people could buy the newspapers or could buy books. And another important thing, there were more and more libraries, like the British Library, for instance, with extended opening hours, including in the evenings, which explains why people could go to the British Library, for instance, or to other libraries in the country, and spend a few hours after work reading the newspapers or reading books without paying anything. So everything was done, not only the scientific inventions, but also the conditions of working, the opening hours, the extended opening hours, to encourage people to read.
There were also the magazines that were cost, like penny. They were called like
Yeah.
penny dreadful stuff.
Absolutely. And as there was this new public who could afford to buy newspapers, magazines, etc., who was able to read, there was a new type of press which emerged, which was the penny press. That is, you paid just 1 penny to buy the magazine or the newspaper. or which is also called the sensational press. The sensational press. And the sensational press especially emerged in the 1880s, and very often historians say that the real birth, it existed before, but the real birth, the real development of the sensational press dates back to the story of Jack the Ripper, the Jack the Ripper case, Jack Léventreur. Why? Because it was such a sensational event that journalists covered the event in details, and they published articles and articles and articles playing on the fears of people. And they also organized a kind of hunt for Jack the Ripper, and people participated in the hunt for Jack the Ripper with the journalists. And from then on, the sensational press in Britain has been playing a crucial role, even today. If you see the Sun, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Express, they still played a very crucial role in the British press. And the sensational press, which was much more accessible for people from the lower classes, accessible in terms of cost, but also accessible in terms of style, in terms of references, in terms of ideas that were developed. Some people from the working class, for instance, could not read an article from the Times for some of them. Their education did not allow them to be able to understand the articles by the Times. Just one example. But the sensational press allowed them to be able to be aware of what was going on around them. Well, very often in a sensational manner, of course, but this was a way of being informed about their society. So, the end of the late Victorian period is to be seen, I think, as a kind of revolution in terms of communication means. First, through the development of the media, the popularization of the media and the popularization of reading. Second, through the invention of the telephone and the telegraph. The telephone and the telegraph, which of course seem to us so obvious today, and the telegraph even seems a little old-fashioned, I would say, in a period when we send instant messages. But the telegraph was a complete upheaval at the time. The telegraph, at the end of the 19th century, and this is typically an invention of the late 19th century, the telegraph was suddenly able to make the world smaller and to give access to the rest of the world to almost everybody. And Britain at the time liked imagining themselves, as I said, as the center, the nervous center of the world, with the telegraph or the telephone allowing them to be in contact with their colonists and the rest of the world. And it is through telegraphs that the newspapers received news about what was going on in Africa, what was going on in India, what was going on in the other countries in the world, so that the news could be more and more diverse, and so that almost everybody could have access to these types of news, right? So the telegraph, like the telephone, makes the world smaller, as I said. So the telegraph, the telephone, the development of the media, and especially of the popular press, all this made information, communication, a complete revolution at the end of the 19th century. And I would go as far as saying that, to me, the effect of this revolution in information and communication was the same, almost the same, as that of the Internet revolution in the years 2000, well, late 19th century, early 21st century. It's at another level, of course, but it was exactly the same impact. The same opening up of new horizons, the same impression that suddenly you were able to be connected to the whole world, and that the whole world became more compact, that it became smaller because you could be in touch with it so easily. Well, of course, if the Victorians had imagined SMSs or the internet, they would have found their own inventions old-fashioned, but at the time it was a complete revolution. And what is very, very interesting is to see that the Victorians had imagined absolutely everything of what is happening today, or almost everything. I found, I don't think I have it here, but I found a cartoon dating back to 1860 or something like that, in which you see a Victorian family in front of a screen, at a time when there was no TV, of course, but they are in front of a screen, and it's 1860. And they are watching the screen, and on the screen they have someone who is obviously their daughter, and she's in Africa, or maybe in India, Africa probably. She's in Africa, so you can see her with elephants, etc. And she's on the phone. She is on the phone, so in the middle of the African jungle, she's on the phone. And she's speaking to her parents through the screen. So it's a Skype session. And this was imagined in 1860, you see. Or you have other cartoons from the time, which show, for instance, a doctor examining his patients on the phone through a screen. So exactly what we're currently speaking of, e-medicine, or e-sessions, or a commander-in-chief of the army giving instructions to his soldiers through a screen and a telephone while the soldiers are fighting in the middle of I don't know which country. So these cartoons are really significant of the fact that the Victorians had imagined so many things about the future. They were not able to do all these things, but they were able to imagine the future of the world. And it's only more than a century later that this became a reality. And there's another cartoon which I particularly like, in which they show, the typical Victorian woman with a long dress and beautiful hair, etc. And she's in a park, and her husband probably is side by side with her, but they're not looking at each other. So each has his back or her back against the tree, but they're not looking at each other. And the husband is on his telegraph, telegraphing a message, and the woman is on her telegraph, telegraphing something. And it seems that there's no communication left between the two, exactly as today some people say that with telephones and messaging and all this, people do not communicate in reality any longer. But this was a cartoon from the late 19th century, which already imagined a society in which people would no longer communicate with each other directly, but through machines, through devices. And it's exactly the same criticism that can be made today, that can be leveled today at the use of the internet, of social networks, etc., etc. So it's quite interesting to see this. Yeah, so these means of communication, they are very important to be taken into account because, of course, they are going to participate in the new visibility of the groups that we're going to study. Women, the poor, aliens. And because more and more people are going to have access to these means of communication, then more and more people would be aware of the existence of these groups, of their specificities, and of their new visibility. So this is why I wanted to develop this point. The second point, of course, is the development of transport. Transport first with the train, symbolical of the Industrial Revolution, and the train which epitomizes the grandeur of Britain at the time, the fact that the train was going to revolutionize the country by allowing people to move from place to place much more easily than before. But there was not only the train. What else can you quote?
Automobiles.
The automobile, well, the automobile is rather the beginning of the 20th century, but it's included in our period, in the Edwardian period. And at the time, even in the Edwardian period, only the very rich owned an automobile. So it's really the beginning of the automobile.
I think it's steaming and, you know, flying.
Yes, so the steamboat, yeah, which was a revolution in the sense that it allowed people to travel more easily, and especially to reach destinations more easily. And the beginning of planes, it's rather the beginning of the 20th century as well, but it's true that it is included in this period as well. So this also made the world smaller, and explorations of the world were made possible thanks to these different means of transport. But there's another means of transport which you have forgotten, and which played a crucial role, especially in the visibility of women at the end of the 19th century, which is
Voting? Voting?
well, the omnibus, yes, the omnibus is important because the omnibus meant that everybody was supposed to be taking this bus. That is, people from all social classes, men and women, etc. So it's true that the omnibus played a role in the visibility of some classes.
Bicycle?
The bicycle, absolutely, the bicycle. The bicycle, as we'll see when we focus on women, the bicycle was really an instrument of emancipation of women at the time. It was a means of transport that they were allowed to use on their own. You see, when you're on a bicycle, you're on your own. You don't have a chaperone, or you don't have a husband or a brother, or you don't have a father with you. You're on your own. And the bicycle was a symbol of women's emancipation, as well as another new phenomenon of the time was a symbol of women's emancipation, as we'll see later, which is the department store. The department store, because the department store was made for women initially, and that it was one of the first public spaces which women could enter on their own, without the presence of a man, a husband, etc. I'm speaking, of course, of middle class and upper middle class and aristocratic. Of course, poor women were in the public sphere from the start because they lived in the streets. This is a very different thing. So, with all these different aspects, these different improvements, the late Victorian age and the Edwardian age, which I'm going to define in a few words, because the period is much shorter. The late Victorian age and the Edwardian age were ages of exploration, spatial exploration. More and more people moved from place to place to visit places. There was the emergence of tourism, mass tourism, for instance. Many expeditions, scientific and other. But also temporal exploration, with an acute interest in exploring the past, prehistory, for instance, or also exploring the future. The first anticipation novels started to be written at the time. If you take The Time Machine, for instance, by Wells, this is typical of this type of exploration of the future. But also cultural exploration. The late 19th century is a period, and we'll see this in the second semester for those of you who do enseignement secondaire, the late 19th century is a period when a multitude of aesthetic movements emerged. Not long-lived movements, most of them were short-lived, but there was a desire to experiment new things, to experience new feelings. So, cultural or aesthetic exploration, and also exploration of the mind. The late 19th century is the period when psychology studies and psychoanalysis emerged. So the exploration of the mind was something particularly crucial in the late Victorian period. I'm just going to say a few words about the Edwardian period. The Edwardian period is very short. It's from 1901 to 1910, so it's 9 years, which is not a long period. But generally it is included with the late Victorian period because it is a kind of prolongation of the late Victorian age. When you think of the Victorian period, very often people think of this period as a kind of a golden parenthesis, a kind of bright parenthesis. After the pessimistic years of the late 19th century, after the death of Queen Victoria, the Edwardian period would be, according to some, a kind of golden parenthesis, a bright parenthesis. You know, it's just before Les Années Folles, it's just before the war, so with all the light-heartedness before the war. But the reality is a little different. It's the mythology of the period, but the reality is a little different. It's true that there was a kind of, almost a kind of relief that the new century had arrived and that, well, the world was still alive in a way. So there was this sense of relief. But at the same time, the Edwardian years, the 9 years of King Edward's reign, were also the years just before the Depression, just before the war, first of all, in 1914, and before the Depression that would follow. So they were not as golden years as some people tried to make the others believe. But it was an age which was marked by the continuation of the improvements of the late Victorian period in terms of transport means, with the development of the automobile, the development of the plane.
I think the fashion was more, visible in that period.
Of course.
The fashion of women changed.
Yes.
Right?
And there was a big change, yes, you're right, in the way. It was a modern period. It was the 20th century, and there had been a turn from the old world, the Victorian world, to the modern
The
world.
Victorian world, the women, when they wore the clothes, it was like big one. But
Yes.
in
And then it was a much
slim
slender.
because they allowed them to work, easily.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll see this when we study these three groups that we're going to study. But it was just to say that there was an obvious continuation between the late Victorian period and the Edwardian period. That some things changed in the Edwardian period due to this this modernity that people wanted to reach. But that, of course, it's not in 9 years that the old world would be completely revolutionized. So the Edwardian period is to be seen as a kind of extension of the late Victorian period and a transition towards modernity. On s'arrête là pour aujourd'hui. Donc vous lisez ce que je vous ai dit dire pour la semaine prochaine, et la semaine prochaine, ça sera beaucoup moins cours magistral puisqu'on va travailler à partir de textes.